Hello, and welcome back to the Land and Climate Podcast. My name is Alasdair, and in this episode I caught up with Danielle Young, Assistant Professor at the School of Politics and International Studies at Leeds University, about her research into the geopolitical and security implications of solar geoengineering, and the use of stratospheric aerosol injection in particular. I should say these are terms Danielle will explain more about in our chat. As climate change progresses unabated, discussions are re-emerging around using geoengineering technology as a means of cooling global temperatures, and there has been conjecture about nations beginning to experiment with its use, not only as a tool for coping with global warming, but also as an instrument of political, military, and state power.
Elite decision-making within major powers is often not focused on securing the well-being of its population. Being willing to sacrifice quite large portions of those populations has been the case for decades, if not longer. And I think SAI in particular, coming into contact with a political agenda, I find it very hard to imagine that it would primarily be a climate intervention. I think it ends up being a tool of power.
I began our conversation by taking a quick step back and asking Danielle Young to explain the basics of solar geoengineering, how it could be deployed, and some of the challenges around its use.
For the past several decades, the interest in solar radiation modification or solar geoengineering has been driven by concerns about the increasing consequences of climate warming from greenhouse gases. And the idea is to increase the reflectivity of the Earth in order to achieve a certain level of cooling. Some of these would be more regional and local with what they call albedo modification. Others would have more global implications. So there's a few different strategies. Some are as simple as just increasing the reflectivity of cities by things like painting roofs white. And there's some work on trying to increase the reflectivity of ice. There's also what they call marine cloud brightening, which is spraying clouds with sea spray to make them a bit more reflective, which would theoretically achieve some regional cooling effects. And that occurs at the level of the troposphere, which is the level where weather happens. And there are some space-based SRM potential interventions with mirrors in space and leveraging satellites and things like that. But the leading contender for this is what they call stratospheric aerosol injections. And this is the idea of spraying reflective aerosols into the stratosphere, which is above the troposphere, in order to achieve a global cooling effect. And the proof of concept for this comes from large volcanic eruptions, where when those go off, and they have to be quite large, like not your average volcanic eruption, there's clear evidence that they cool global temperatures by 0.5 to even up to 3 degrees on the historical record for about 12 to 18 months, give or take. They also often tend to come with a number of negative side effects. But because of that cooling effect, there's been some interest in seeing if it's possible to harness those kinds of dynamics and avoid some of the more catastrophic side effects that can sometimes accompany those. And there's been growing research into this over the past couple of decades. I think it's actually the 20-year anniversary of when an atmospheric scientist, Paul Crutzen, lifted a taboo on this research by saying this is something we need to look into because we're not doing enough on climate change. These are ideas that had been around for many decades before that, but they've accelerated and come onto a scientific agenda in the past couple of decades, which has started to accelerate further in the past few years. But a key thing about all of these, particularly important with SAI, is that this is not a solution to the problem of climate change. It's a mask of the greenhouse gas effect. If the mask is disrupted, then the greenhouse gas effect would rebound. With SAI, this would require fairly continuous injections. So the capacity requirements are such that you would likely need fleets of aircraft that could do injections in both hemispheres. That's a key thing to avoid some of those major consequences of volcanic eruptions. And you would have to do this on a relatively continuous basis because those aerosols will wash out after 12 to 18 months. And if they do that, then you'll start to get that greenhouse gas effect rebound. And if you have not stopped putting more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, that rebound effect will be higher than what you started off with, which is what they call termination shock or termination risk. You are likely looking at a very long-term intervention because it takes a long time for greenhouse gases to be drawn down out of the atmosphere, particularly carbon. And once you start doing this after a few years, you have that termination effect if it gets disrupted. And there are some assessments, most of them say you're looking at least a multi-decadal commitment, but it could be a century or more. We don't really have political institutions that are effective at governing over time periods like that. We have political institutions or regimes that theoretically do that for things like nuclear weapons and nuclear waste. But if you dig into that, they don't actually. On paper, this is what they're trying to do, but they're not particularly effective on these kinds of things. At least in the long term, there's lots of questions, particularly about the management of nuclear waste. So that's one of the key questions is the further you go out in time, who will be responsible for maintaining this? And to my mind, it always raises that question about, we have a hard time conceptualizing climate change, especially as a lay person, when you hear something like we could be looking at a 2 to 3 degrees Celsius rise. That doesn't necessarily connect that easily with people because a day-to-day experience of a 2 to 3 degrees Celsius rise is just weather. But it obviously has very serious implications, more broadly speaking, if that is a consistent rise. I don't think it's likely that a major SAI deployment would go that well politically, which we can return back to. But if it did, you do this for 20, 30, 40 years, and you have new generations of political leaders who it's very hard for them to wrap their minds around how catastrophic it could be if it does get disrupted, or if you do stop for some reason, because they just haven't had that experience. It's not internalized in the same way. And there are things that could make you think we could shift these resources away from this. I was worried about, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Carrington event. So in the 1800s, there was a massive solar storm. This was before there was widespread electrification that led to a kind of global disruption of electrification, disrupting telegraph lines and all of that stuff. If it happened today, because of the levels of electrification we have, and they are trying to prepare grids, it could be massively catastrophic and it could disrupt flights and that sort of stuff. Are we responsible enough to undertake these kinds of interventions and rely on the idea that people will be careful indefinitely? Because we've gotten to this point with climate, so it doesn't suggest that we're good at those kinds of long-term risk assessments.
So your research and your position is essentially that we should be looking at stratospheric aerosol injection more from a kind of security conflict lens, and that maybe we've been looking at too much, or there's been too much dominance of the climate perspective on it, and then that's also shrouded on the potential dangers around it. Yeah?
Yeah. So another element of this is that interest in large-scale interference with the climate system goes back much longer than our concerns about climate change. So if you look even back into the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, there was significant interest in both the US and the Soviet Union in the potential for climate control or harnessing other physical processes in the way that had been done with nuclear weapons. There's kind of this mastery idea over these physical processes, and that wasn't achieved, but there's certainly interest in it. And a huge amount of the investment and development of things like meteorological sciences was focused around this. And these were seen as at least potential arenas for geopolitical competition. And I don't think that that's ever completely gone away. If you're familiar with the work of someone like Kevin Surprise, he's traced the geopolitical ecology of these technologies and where the research is done and where the interest has come from over the course of decades.
And you point in your research to a recent Pentagon paper. Can you tell us a little bit about the paper?
I think you're talking about the Joint Concept for Competing. That was a 2023 update. But people think of strategic competition in terms of weaponry, but actually it's about exploiting any arena in which you might have some kind of advantage. And that explicitly refers to environmental and geophysical arenas. And that also has quite a long history. If you look at the sort of interrelationship between the scientific establishment in the US and the US government and military during the Cold War, they're closely intertwined. The same thing is true of the Soviet Union And that never completely ended. There were shifts that happened after the end of the Cold War, but there is a reinforcing relationship between them. And there's plenty of stuff about this that's not just about geoengineering. There's a book called Strange Stability by Benjamin Wilson that's very good on how these are reinforcing security and scientific relationships that lead you to approach even things like environmental science from a very different perspective than those that are just concerned about climate change as a threat to human security, like the well-being of populations. Another thing I tried to bring forward in my work is that elite decision-making within major powers is often not focused on securing the well-being of its population. Being willing to sacrifice quite large portions of those populations has been the case for decades, if not longer. You see this if you look at declassified strategy documents around nuclear weapons, biological weapons programs, chemical weapons programs, or even the US or the Russian war with Ukraine. This is not good for the Russian population. You're trying to secure a particular understanding of state interests, which is somewhat disconnected from the well-being of a population.
Let me just talk a little bit about where SAI is, I suppose, and who's developing it at the moment. I think you've cited Russia, China, Israel, the US. They're all in some way looking at using it or developing it. Is that correct?
So there are some assessments out there. There's a piece by Josh Horton and Wake Smith and I think David Keith that came out a couple of years ago on what they call PLUS deployments, so planetary, large-scale, uninterrupted. It's basically long-term, large-scale deployments of SAI. And there's about 10 countries, plus maybe a couple of more if they had backing to do this, that have the capacity requirements for that kind of deployment. And those are the US, China, Russia, India, Brazil, Japan, France, Germany, the UK, Canada, and it might be missing. And some people will include Israel, Saudi Arabia, depending upon their access to some of this. And most of that has to do with their aerospace industry capacity. There's also probably another configuration of EU states or Arctic states that could do this just because of Cold War technology related to aerospace industry if they work together. So it's, do you theoretically have the ability to produce the engine aircraft and aircrafts themselves that could get aircraft to the stratosphere with a payload and spray it? There's some recent research assessing existing commercial aircraft that might be able to do that, at least within the polar regions, because you might not have to fly as high. But in any case, there's also that question about the difference between commercial and military aircraft. And it's harder to get a clear assessment of what those things are, but there's likely military aircraft that could be retrofitted to do at least a starting deployment. This is a list of states that do not necessarily have a history of having climate at the center of their decision-making. And there is this disconnect in the conversations about SAI where people talk about this as being an intervention for the climate vulnerable or placing that forward. But these are not actors that do things for the climate vulnerable. Those that are closest to what you would probably need in terms of capacity to do a large-scale deployment are the US, China, and Russia for single hemisphere interventions. And with the others on that list, they have the aerospace capacity, but they probably don't have the access to territory that you need without coordination between them, nor the political clout to do this without being stopped necessarily. Whereas when you're talking about the US and China or Russia, I think people underestimate the potential issues with Russia here because their interest in this technology may be as a form of political disruption. Like a single hemisphere deployment would be quite catastrophic for them as well, but it's a very effective threat for political leverage. I don't think we need to go too far into an analysis of Russia to understand that that is worth taking seriously, particularly as the special military operation in Ukraine, as they euphemistically refer to it, it's not going particularly well. You've got a major power backed into a corner looking for options to stay relevant, and that's a slightly easier arena and less catastrophic arena than nuclear confrontation. The US is really the only actor that has the access to territory globally based off of its distribution of bases that could do this relatively quickly if they decided that they wanted to. People sometimes look at things like procurement timelines and how long it would take to develop, but a lot of that comes down to motivations, like how motivated you are to mobilize the capacity to do something. One of the things that I point out is that the Manhattan Project took 2 years. The Manhattan Project is the code name for the US and Allied program to develop nuclear weapons during World War II. And that was a massive industrial undertaking, far more than what it would require to produce fleets of aircraft to do an SAI intervention. So a lot of that comes down to will, because there are some that have the resources.
Can we talk about costs briefly?
I think one of the things that appears to be appealing about SAI is that it's relatively cheap to do. I think depends on who is speaking about it. I've heard people say, well, if you give me $10 billion, I could get a program going, kind of thing. There's a difference between those initial startup costs and the maintenance. If you are looking at generations of fleets of aircraft, that is actually substantial over time.
But if we're talking about, say, a Russia that were to do a one-off, that is a relatively cheap endeavor.
This is another thing which I think is actually quite important in this conversation that drops out quickly is there is a difference between what it takes to do an SAI deployment well in terms of the climate and what it takes to do an SAI deployment. If you don't care that much about what the climate effects are, doing an SAI deployment, the requirements, those are lower. And actually, this speaks to one of the reasons that I work in this space, because there are a lot of people who think that you just shouldn't work on this topic at all because any research you do, even if it's critical, sort of socializes it into the world, that you're contributing to bringing it about. And I'm sympathetic to that. But to me, the technological barriers to entry for SAI are lower than the uncertainties about the effects, particularly if those deployments are not focused on climate amelioration. And there is modeling research that's starting to be done on non-ideal deployments, things like uneven termination, but we still don't know enough. And there are also a number of uncertainties in the models that are used for SAI themselves that create major open questions, particularly for key ecosystems and different regions in the world. And so you could have actors engage in this without necessarily being prepared for what that looks like for different regions, ecosystems, etc. I find it hard to imagine that some actors will not try this on a relatively short timeline. And the reasons for that are not necessarily because of climate, but because of issues, drivers around strategic competition, because this is a technological intervention with global impacts. Being an actor who can cross that finish line or claim to have that kind of signaling ability is something that can be quite appealing if you're looking at periods of intense conflict or just competition between major powers.
Okay, and just for listeners, could we maybe go through a sort of hypothetical example of what could happen with one of these?
I think this is becoming increasingly less hypothetical. Over the past few months, there have been 3 different right-wing think tanks in the US that have produced reports about SRM with slightly different framings. So one of them is framing it in terms of weather sovereignty and securing the atmosphere. Others have spoken about it in terms of avoiding an uneconomic transition. It's quite interesting because they're still denying climate change or very seriously minimizing it, but also basically saying the real risk of climate change is people trying to push us towards an uneconomic transition away from fossil fuels. And this is a way to resist that. The securing the atmosphere, stratosphere, and weather sovereignty framings are more likely to be taken up because those are long-standing threads around this research, particularly in the US context. And with some of the work that I've been doing recently with a network of experts, what kept emerging is that it is perfectly possible to think about the desirability of pursuing SAI capabilities that does not acknowledge climate change as a reality. This is an emerging technology with global security implications, and you want to be first. And you want to be in control. and you don't want others to have those kinds of capabilities or to not have them yourself. Julius Schubert is one of the people who's tracked this a bit. But if you go back through the past 20 years or so, there have been a number of congressional hearings in the US that have talked about SRM. One of the things that you notice when you go through those records is that there is almost always a question about China. And does China have an SRM program? But the thing that stands out to me is there's not necessarily a huge amount of interest in the scope or the seriousness or the status of those programs, but do they exist or do they not? Which suggests to me that you're trying to create a permission structure to justify moving ahead for yourself. This has a lot of historical precedent. During the Cold War, you first had what they called the bomber gap and then the missile gap, where a justification for expanding bombing capacity, like airplane bombers, and then the development of missiles was justified by claims that the Soviet Union was racing ahead and the US was being left behind. And so it justified massive expansions of those capabilities and investments in them. In both cases, it wasn't true, but it didn't need to be true. And it's also worth remembering that even when it was known that it wasn't true, that was still a justification that was offered. Like with the Kennedy administration, there came a point where Kennedy knew there wasn't a missile gap, but still kept talking about a missile gap in order to justify expanding those capabilities. And so to me, I perceive that there's at least the ground being laid for those kinds of dynamics if that becomes appealing to US actors. I don't think that that is particularly unique to the Trump administration. I think that in many ways with US foreign policy right now, what you see is an amplification rather than a departure. If you followed the SRM conversations over the past couple of decades, the US has been quite resistant to governance discussions in this arena, regardless of the administration. And it's actually not the case. I hear this a lot where people are like, well, people just don't know about SRM. There are certainly people and actors that do know about SRM, not just in the US. Just because they don't draw attention to it or speak about it publicly does not mean that it's in the minds of some particularly security practitioners. And with the UNEA resolutions that have failed trying to introduce discussions around SRM governance, the US has been part of what quashed those in both cases. The reasoning there, not just under the Trump administration, is they let us handle this mentality, which is consistent with how they tend to be about powerful technologies anyway. It's certainly a historical parallel with nuclear weapons. That would have been the US's preference to just be the responsible actor for these weapons. But also with what is happening with AI right now, where it's sort of you want to be able to have as much power over these as possible. And you can maybe sell that as on behalf of other people, on behalf of other nations, but it doesn't have to be that way.
So just to recap a little bit there on the things you've mentioned, which is that at the moment, there really isn't any agreed governance mechanisms on SRM or stratospheric aerosol injection. There is a possibility, I guess you're saying, that the US could, and at some stage, deploy, and that they're talking about in a similar way to which the weapons were developed.
Yeah, if you do look at the history of nuclear weapons, I mean, a huge justification for the Manhattan Project. And there had been major breakthroughs in physics, which indicated that developing such a weapon might be possible. And at that time, a lot of that science was happening in Europe. Those were where these discoveries were being made. And there were a couple of key physicists. There's the Einstein-Szilard letter, where they highlighted to the Roosevelt administration that it would be possible to make weapons that harness these physical properties that are massively destructive on a scale that has not ever been seen before. And there was concern that the Nazis were interested in doing that and that they had a program to do it. It's not that there was never any interest, but they were not on the right track with it and also ended up not investing those resources. And there did come a point where at least certain actors in the US security establishment knew that, but did not tell the scientists that. Many of the scientists had fled the Holocaust, so they're deeply afraid of the Nazi regime. The idea of a weapon like that potentially being developed by them really drives their interest in contributing to a project to develop something in the hands of the US. That project, they managed to do this, which is really difficult to quickly give an understanding of just how massive an undertaking this was. Because I think when people know about the Manhattan Project, they often think about Los Alamos as being where it happened, but it actually happened all over North America to do the refining of the radioactive materials and things like that. And it was hidden. And the ability to do that, the resources that were mobilized are astonishing. This happens sometimes when I talk about these parallels. I'm not saying that SAI is as immediately dangerous as nuclear weapons, and accidents with SAI are also not as immediately dangerous. One of the potential appeals around it is that you can still have these global effects and you can still engage in this prestige signaling and this kind of arms race over control of a planetary technology, but you're not as immediately risking the end of the world with nuclear weapons. And it's cheaper.
Which is why you were hinting that Russia could be a potential actor in this.
You don't even have to deploy, but to have that threat. This also happens with nuclear weapons, where you're just threatening, like, I will do this if you do that kind of thing. Russia has been doing a lot of nuclear saber rattling in the past few years as sort of a way, once nuclear weapons are introduced into the international system. To me, there's always been a little bit of we're in Schrodinger's international system, because you have the major political authorities are states. But if you're not a nuclear state, that really changes your leverage within the system. And if you are, it's very difficult to hold you accountable if there is some kind of credible understanding that you might actually be driven to engaging with these. But even if you don't intend to use them, there have been so many near misses and mistakes. They're just dangerous to have existing anyway. The only thing that's more dangerous than a well-maintained nuclear weapon is a poorly maintained nuclear weapon. And there are those as well.
I just wanted to quickly finish off on one of these examples on what could actually happen. I think it's quite good for listeners to be able to visualize what may go on. So a country could, for example, just deploy SAI, and then what would happen physically?
I mean, it depends on what that deployment looks like. From the climate science perspective, a lot of their reflections and interests are focused on a gradual move to achieve a relatively small amount of warning to hold temperatures in place. But you don't have to have that. If you develop the capabilities, you could go for something more dramatic to make it clear that you've done something. One of the other issues in this space is the monitoring and verification and trust in that. People could claim that they've done a deployment, or people could claim somebody else has, and that is what has caused some kind of extreme event. Whether that's actually true is a separate issue. If countries don't trust each other, they could still exploit that misinformation, and it could lead to confrontation if you claim somebody else is messing with the atmosphere or that you have done so. I think there's a lot of focus on the idea of a global thermostat and who has control. One of the big questions when people talk about weaponization is they think of a weapon like a gun, like you point it at someone and it does what you want it to. I don't think it necessarily has to go that far. It could just be about, like, I have control of this capability and you don't, and the climate impacts are secondary. And maybe those climate impacts would not necessarily be that negative depending on how you did it. If there's a single hemisphere deployment, that would have quite negative effects if it was a large-scale deployment, like what you see with a volcanic eruption, with crop failures and stuff. I don't necessarily think that far ahead to the climate effects. I think about the effects of the claims and counterclaims between major powers about what they've done or claim to have done, and how that could lead them to confrontation anyway. Because going back to this framing that's starting to emerge about weather sovereignty and securing the stratosphere, if you want to scare your population into supporting an activity, you can say China is trying to mess with the atmosphere. China is trying to control the atmosphere. And even if they can't actually control, that could still justify confrontation that doesn't just occur within the climate or the atmospheric arena. I think this is another part of the discussion that sometimes gets missed, is that you don't have to respond to an action in the same domain that the action occurred. If somebody does something you don't like, you could respond with sanctions, with targeting something else. We see this with what's happening with Iran, where the US is bombing Iran, and their response is to take over the Straits of Hormuz. It's not to try to bomb the US. You don't have to do a one-to-one kind of thing. And that's another thing about SAI for me is that I think in the climate research community that works on it, it's at the center of their thinking, and that's understandable. But to me, it's just in a constellation amongst a bunch of other issues. It's just one other arena of potential competition, confrontation. So it could be an option that you have, a threat that you have, a move that you could make if you are engaged in conflict or competition with other actors across a range of different domains.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I wanted to ask you, I was interested in something that you'd said in one of your papers around the use of climate scientists around geoengineering. I might have misinterpreted this, but I think something about what you were saying was hinting at a sort of naivety in the way that they've been researching geoengineering, the SAI, and that they've kind of missed out on the wider impacts that it could have.
This is kind of a difficult conversation to navigate. I work closely with a number of climate scientists who do work on this, and I respect them, and I think that they're very smart people. But there are different rational frames, and there are things that I can imagine actors doing based off of their historical patterns and behavior that I think if you are centering SRM as a climate intervention don't really occur to you. So something like using the threat of the single hemisphere deployment for political leverage does not necessarily occur to them. There's increasing interest around SRM for the polar regions because they are warming very rapidly and they have very significant global impacts because of what they call teleconnections and things like that. So in a certain sense, it makes sense that you want to stabilize these regions, especially when you're talking about the Arctic. I remember a couple of years ago, I was in a workshop with mostly climate modelers, and they were talking about the different ideas for refreezing the Arctic. I'm sitting in this conversation going, you guys know you can't just go to the Arctic and refreeze it, don't you? And they're talking about the technical side of it. I'm like, that's not what I mean. You have to get permission to do that. And I don't think that you will, maybe on like a small scale. But even if the actors that claim the Arctic agree with what they want to have happen with it, they may just not agree on principle. There's still this tension, recognition amongst the Arctic states and the non-Arctic states interested in the region that the climate side and the environmental side is really consequential. The very apparent interest in the possibilities that they think might be opened up by warming in the region, just on the assessments of the resources that might be uncovered, the sea routes, that kind of thing. So there's this constant tension. And I was at an event a few months ago with a naval officer where I was talking about that discussion, and he basically giggled. He's like, who's going to let them do that? I'm not. Not everybody wants the Arctic to be refrozen. And that assessment is probably incorrect in a certain sense because it's actually probably harder to access those resources even with melting because of the disruption, and the costs aren't worth it. But it takes a long time for people to give up on the idea that they might access trillions of dollars worth of whatever they think might be uncovered. So that's a good encapsulation of there's this disconnect between what the geopolitical issues in the region are versus the climate and environmental. There are crossovers between both, but it depends on who gets to make decisions about what they think is important in the moment. I think maybe naivete is the wrong word, but it depends on where your focus is or where you're pointing your analysis, because I still have questions about what you get in models because of uncertainties in the models. But if you are in that world, there's probably a strong environmental case that you could make on the basis of that, even if there's outstanding questions about it. But to me, it's completely disconnected from the political case. And I think SAI in particular, coming into contact with a political agenda, I find it very hard to imagine that it would primarily be a climate intervention. I think it ends up being a tool of power and control over capabilities and signals. And I think Josh Horton has a piece in Environmental Politics talking about the prestige, the symbolic appeal of SRM. And I think there's definitely more work to be done on that. The other part of this conversation that I try to insist upon that I think sometimes gets dropped out when people talk about SRM governance is I put on my IR professor hat because they're sort of like, well, states aren't moving fast enough, so we'll just develop a governance framework without them. The states are the ones that govern. They are the fundamental primary actors in the international system. So if you come up with a governance platform that they're not involved in, you haven't come up with a governance platform. You've come up with a voluntary set of principles that no one can enforce. That's not governance. And there's also no example I can think of, and I've been asking around, in which private or non-state actors have developed a governance platform that was then taken up by states wholesale. That's not how this happens. And because SRM touches on so many different domains, there will have to be negotiations between states that about SRM that also have nothing to do with SRM, like where the monitoring capabilities are. How does this impinge upon other things that they care about? There is a tendency in the SRM research community to articulate a desire for global, democratic, transparent governance. But that is not generally what you get when you are talking about technological interventions with global implications. You're usually looking at a hierarchical, exclusionary governance regime that involves the most powerful actors making decisions for everybody else, and they just have to live with it. I have yet to be persuaded that that is not the road that you're on with SAI. I hope that that's not the case, but I think it would take a great deal of work for that to not be the case. And I don't know that that work is being done yet, because I think there's a certain resistance to being honest about what the starting point is. This is a very difficult time to be introducing governance for a planetary technology. And it's a planetary technology that will be governed by an international system, which wasn't really designed for that and isn't that good at it.
Where can we go next?
I don't think that this goes away. So I think the positive thing to say is that we tend to muddle through. If you engage and work through these issues, this is something I've been trying to do with my work over the last year, is like, where are the points at which you could start to build a path to governance? And there are some. And some of those involve collaboration and cooperation around monitoring and detection and building trust around those capabilities. And in many ways, those capabilities exist. It's just figuring out how to leverage them for what you want and, who has control. And that's a path to governance in tough geopolitical times anyway. If you look at the Antarctic Treaty, the Outer Space Treaty, also arms control, these things come about through relationship building, often via scientific collaboration, which it's not an innocent process, but it's not impossible.
Okay, when you're saying monitoring, was it monitoring verification?
Monitoring and verification is the term that comes up in a lot of governance regimes across a range of domains. So nuclear weapons, certainly, but others as well. But I think in the SAI conversation, it's monitoring detection.
So when you're talking about monitoring detection and attribution, you're talking about a level of transparency about states and what capabilities they have around SRM or SAI.
There's that. At the most basic level, if you're talking about things like sulfur flumes for SAI, we have satellite capacity to see that already with the Tropomi satellites, which are part of the Copernicus suite, which are downloaded in places like Svalbard, Svalstat, and also in Antarctica. We need more on what the interactions are with different ecosystems. You need better and more Earth observation data about effects over time. And there's still a lag. Even if you see that this is happening, figuring out, is it a volcanic eruption, but also what the effects are, takes longer than just the detection if it's large scale. Even if you have those technical capacities, you have to have trust in whatever is being reported. That is where you need to build some of these governance possibilities, because right now, let's say it happens to be Russia that says that they have monitored and seen that there has been some kind of deployment. People are probably not going to trust whatever information that they share. And that may increasingly be a problem with the US and certainly with China. These actors don't trust each other and others don't trust them for good reason. Whereas middle power actors, if you're looking at Canada and EU, they may have some coalition and capacity building around being a trusted source of information about detecting deployments and monitoring effects and things like that, which is not a very satisfying answer. People who work on this want to move quickly. and they want to unveil a whole governance sort of regime, but that's not how you get to these things.
And are there any middle power governments, officials within those governments actually working on any of this?
I think this is a misconception, and I don't want to speak too far out of turn on this, but there's a resistance amongst environmental ministries or departments to engaging with this subject too much, but that is not the same for foreign affairs and defense departments. There's, at least, especially in some EU countries, an awareness of this. I think one of the issues here, the reason why these conversations aren't more openly public, is I was at an event earlier this week where somebody was saying that policymakers don't like to engage with SRM or with geoengineering because they're not sure what needs to be governed. I don't think that's the case. I think many policymakers don't like to directly engage with this topic because they know what needs to be governed. They have a sense of how much would have to be addressed, and that the process of that could be politically destabilizing in itself. The questions you have to address, the issues you have to negotiate are very tough, and raising those questions and having those conversations and engaging in those negotiations could contribute to exacerbating already existing tensions. Most of the time, of the complexities and difficulties surrounding governance and ineffective governance, quote unquote, in climate and that sort of thing is not largely because they don't understand that climate is important. A lot of other things are important as well. And it's difficult to come to agreements on these things. I heard this recently in a workshop where scientists were like, we just need to communicate the risks of climate more clearly, and then people will do what they need to do. And I think that's somewhat insulting to the number of reports and reviews and institutions and organizations that have been communicating about the risks of climate change for a long time. But one of the specific things they said was basically, why didn't the UNFCCC think of doing X? And I'm saying, well, because they had to negotiate a treaty. And this is what it was possible to agree on. It's not that they didn't understand there were other issues that are important, but it was not possible to agree on those. So the path to governance is always difficult. Regulations are written in blood. There usually have to be costs and consequences to get people to the table to actually manage something. International law and governance is always hard won. I hope this isn't the case, and I've started to see more possibility in terms of relationship building through collaboration as a path to governance. But one of the paths to governance runs through bad deployment. Somebody does something stupid, you experience the consequences, and then you get key actors together that say, right, that's enough. These are where the lines are. I am deeply sympathetic to people who are in this field because they're worried about climate change. We're not doing enough, and this is something it seems like perhaps we could do. But that, I think, is not a sufficient accounting for the conditions that it would be introduced into. I certainly hope that I'm wrong, but you'd have to make me wrong. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in order for that to not be the case. And I'm not sure that that work is being done because it's not work that can really be done by scientists that can contribute to it, but scientists also don't govern. I've had to start reminding myself that I don't need to persuade scientists that they're not going to be in charge of SRM technologies because they're just not going to be in charge. I don't need to expend a huge amount of energy on that because there are times where it's like, well, they're like, we'll just do this. I'm like, you won't do anything. And this has come up too. I think there's been more awareness in the community recently about the risks of securitizing SRM. This is a little bit too oversimplistic, but I'm sort of like, we shouldn't securitize SRM. I'm like, yeah, no, but we don't. So I wouldn't worry about it.
Thanks very much to Danielle Young for her time in recording this episode. You will see in our podcast blurb and on our website that we have a very comprehensive further reading list on this issue provided by Danielle, which I do recommend you look at. Thanks also to Vasco Kostovsky for audio engineering the show, and we'll be back again in 2 weeks. And also to say, if you do like listening to the show, we'd be very grateful if you could give our podcast a review or even a star rating, as that will help others to find us. My name is Alasdair McEwen, and thanks for listening.